There are two antithetical forms of this relation. One is a relationship to the state power and wealth as to something of like nature to itself. The other as to something disparate from it. The consciousness which finds them of like nature to itself is noble. It sees in public authority what is in accord with itself, sees in it its own simple essence and the factual evidence of it. And in the service of that authority, its attitude towards it is one of actual obedience and respect. Similarly, in the case of wealth, it sees that this procures for it awareness of its other essential side, the consciousness of being for itself. It therefore looks upon wealth likewise as essential in relation to itself and acknowledges the source of its enjoyment as a benefactor to whom it lies under an obligation. In the previous paragraph, Hegel had made a distinction within consciousness itself in terms of the good and bad no longer being simply one polarity or the other with state power and wealth, but in terms of the consciousness itself. Here in paragraph 500, he's going to start to spell this out, and he's going to talk about one of these key terms here, the noble or edelmutige, right? The literal nobly minded, nobly spirited consciousness. And then afterwards he'll talk about the base consciousness in the next paragraph. And what he tells us is that we can see this split taking place within consciousness itself. There's an unlikeness, if we want to play on the gleich and ungleich, the like, and here translated by Miller, disparate, right? Unlike aspects within consciousness itself. But there's two possibilities for how consciousness comports itself in relation to state power and in relation to wealth. Notice that Hegel doesn't give us four different possible combinations here where perhaps consciousness could be like to state power but unlike to wealth, or unlike to state power and like to wealth. Instead, it's either like to both of them or unlike to both of them. And why is that the case? Well, consciousness itself is not identifying itself with these two powers, these two modes of the ethical substance, state power and wealth. It is being itself, and it's being itself in relation to both of these. It's a sort of global comportment in relation to the social world. So how does Hegel frame this? He says there are two opposed forms of this relation. One is a relation to the state power and wealth as something of like nature, something gleich to itself. The other is something disparate from it. So he says the consciousness which finds them of like nature is the noble consciousness, right? Now, what makes it noble? Here's where Hegel gets into some description. He's not going to flesh this out completely. He's giving us the outline at this point. We're going to have to look a few paragraphs ahead to see it spelled out in great detail. What does it see in state power? It finds its own essence, as we've seen already, in the state power, in the authority that is vested there. It says it finds its own simple essence and the evidence of it. And what does it provide then? What is the relation to the state power and its authority? It says, in the service of that authority, its attitude towards it is one of actual obedience and respect. That is what makes it a noble consciousness. Now, it's not, simply obeisance. It doesn't, I am not worthy at all or anything like that. It sees the state power as of like nature to itself. So it can recognize that it's something, it sees itself as good, and it can see the state power as good. And that is why it can render it obedience and respect. It might have to, extend it a little bit of license at certain points. You look at the king and you're like, well, he's not that good of a king, but I guess, kingship, the authority, I really need to make an effort here to show some respect. Or we can talk about the office of the presidency. Or we can talk, in very simple terms of the president of the PTA or some other, low-level organization like that. So long as we're treating it as something where there is a legitimate authority, this is a possibility for the noble consciousness. We would use other terms in our own time. We wouldn't talk about it in terms of noble. We might say stand-up person or, somebody of integrity. But that's what Hegel is after here. What about in relation to wealth? So there's also a finding something of like nature to itself in wealth here as well. And he says, in the case of wealth, it sees that this wealth procures for it awareness of its other essential side. This is also essential. This is also wesentlich, right? Consciousness of being for itself. Wealth is what offers, in this scheme, the very possibility of being for itself. And so he says, it looks upon wealth as essential in relation to itself and acknowledges wealth as the source of its enjoyment, as a benefactor to whom it lies under an obligation. So it treats the wealth, and by this we don't just mean, having money or currency or something like that, but this whole economic process, it sees that as providing the human being, the noble consciousness, with an understanding of what it is and with something that it can enjoy. It is wealth, or the economic process, is a benefactor. And it recognizes its own role in this. It might see itself, as a job creator or as, a consumer, a good consumer that is promoting the benefit to all within the system. So this is the mindset of the noble consciousness. The consciousness which adopts the other relation is, on the contrary, ignoble. It clings to the disparity between the two essentialities, thus sees in the sovereign power a fetter and a suppression of its own being for self, and therefore hates the ruler, obeys only with a secret malice, and is always on the point of revolt. It sees, too, in wealth, by which it attains to the enjoyment of its own self-centered existence, only the disparity with its permanent essence. Since through wealth it becomes conscious of itself merely as an isolated individual, conscious only of a transitory enjoyment, loving yet hating wealth. And with the passing of the enjoyment of something that is essentially evanescent, it regards its relation to the rich as also having vanished. In paragraph 501, Hegel now begins to treat what we call the base or ignoble, in German niederträchtige, consciousness. And we're going to talk about that term and why it is sort of interesting in its original in just a moment. But what we want to keep in mind is we're looking at the same sort of schema, right? We have a consciousness. There's an antithesis between the noble and the base, two different ways of looking at things. And what constitutes those ways of looking at things, whether it sees in state power or in wealth, which is at the opposite end of state power, something like itself, something unlike itself, something, as we have translated, like or disparate, something equal to itself, or you might even say adequate to itself, or something in which there's a kind of disharmony, a conflict, a not fitting together, a incommensurability, we might say. And so the ignoble consciousness, the base consciousness, is going to look at these two things in a very different way. It's almost as if it's seeing a completely different social world than what the noble consciousness is seeing. So what we're setting up here is not only a conflict between, say, state power and wealth, but between these two different kinds of consciousness and the way in which they interpret matters. They're in a way incommensurable with each other. So Hegel tells us that it clings to the disparity between the two essentialities. Now that's an interesting place to start. With the noble consciousness, what we saw is it could go for state power because that's like itself. It can also go for wealth because that's like itself. And the two of those could be harmonized in a certain sense with each other. They could work together. What about the ignoble consciousness? No, this is what is aware of the conflicts, the contradictions taking place. That's part of what makes it ignoble. It can't be content. It can't find its place. This is going to be very important from the perspective of culture, as we're going to see as we go through later paragraphs. So he says it sees in the sovereign power a fetter and a suppression of its own being for self. If we want to be a little facetious here, the state power is the man that you want to stick it to, but you can't. You have to be quiet and know your place and do your job because you don't want to get punished. But you would love to speak up. You would love to do things differently, do things the way that you see them as fit, but state power gets in your way. The law, the government. It's telling you what to do. It's constituting an impediment to realizing your own desires, to realizing what it is that you're meant to be, your being for itself. So what is the attitude then? Here Hegel talks about malice and revolt. It obeys only with a secret malice. It does obey, but secretly inside it wants to say, screw you. I'm not doing what you want me to do. And so this is the waiter who spits in your food. This is the person who, through sort of willful carelessness, screws up the thing for the governmental office. This is the clerk who fills out forms slightly incorrect and gums up the work. So, yeah, secret malice, and as he says, a kind of revolt, right? He says it's always on the point of revolt. It's always ready. It may spend its entire life or career never actually revolting, but it's right there. If they just push me one more bit. If you've ever seen the movie Office Space, somebody who I suppose is kind of like that, although in a certain respect he does embody certain aspects of the noble consciousness, but then I guess becomes the base consciousness, is Milton with his stapler. If they'd just given him his friggin' stapler back, he wouldn't have burned the whole place down. Right? But many people just suffer in silence, or they say little things here and there about the state power. They see the emblems or the representatives of it, and then they always got to have a little bit of things to say, often perhaps in social media. By the way, this is similar to what Nietzsche later on is going to call the spirit of ressentiment, isn't it? Now, what about wealth? So Hegel talks about that here as well. He says it sees in wealth by which it attains to the enjoyment of its own self-centered existence, so wealth is good for something, right? Only the disparity with its permanent essence. Only something that can't really give it what it wants. This we might not only think of in terms of money can't buy you happiness or money can't buy you love, but also in terms of that by this point, old idea of 400 channels and nothing on. You can have all these things offered to you, but none of them seem to really satisfy. And you identify yourself through consumption, through production, through exchange, but none of it ever really comes close to what it is that you truly desire. What do you get instead? He talks about experiencing oneself as an isolated individual. And when we think of the world in terms of wealth rather than in terms of the state, that is, in fact, how we look at things. Homo economicus is indeed a person all by themselves without any sort of social ties, just a bunch of preferences. That's a form of what Hegel's calling the ignoble consciousness or the base consciousness. We also have transitory enjoyment. We don't have any truly satisfying enjoyment that a person can have once and then be done with. No, it all goes away. He says, this person then loves and hates wealth. And with the passing of the enjoyment, something that is essentially evanescent, it regards its relation to the rich as also having vanished. So this is something unstable. And in both cases, there is a lack of, well, I brought up this, ungleich and gleich, there is an inadequacy, an inadequation, a not being entirely what one wants to be. This niederträchtige is kind of interesting, right? Because this is actually a more active way of talking about things. This is the person who pulls things down, nieder, below, who needs to disparage, who needs to see things in a worse way. That's why I brought up Nietzschean ressentiment, which I think is perfectly appropriate to see here in terms of the noble and the base consciousness. Now, these relations express, in the first instance, the judgment, the determination of what these two essential realities are as objects for consciousness, not as yet what they are in and for themselves. The reflection which is presented in the judgment is partly an affirmation of the one as of the other only for us, and is therefore an equal annulling of both. It is not yet the reflection of them for consciousness itself. Partly at first they simply are as essences. They have not become such, nor do they possess self-consciousness. That for which they are is not that which animates them. They are predicates, which are not yet themselves subject. On account of this separation, the whole of the spiritual judgment falls apart into two consciousnesses, each of which is subject to a one-sided determination. Now, just as at first the indifference of the two sides of the alienation, one of which was the in itself of pure consciousness, that is, the specific thoughts of good and bad, the other, their existence as state, power, and wealth, was raised into a relation between them, into a judgment, so must this external relation be raised to an inner unity or to a relation of thought to actuality, and the spirit of both forms of the judgment must make its appearance. This happens when the judgment becomes a syllogism, that is, becomes the mediating process in which the necessity and the middle term of both sides of the judgment come to view. Here in paragraph 502, Hegel is now bringing in some logical considerations that have to do specifically with these notions of the noble and base consciousness and what we're supposed to do with this in relation to state, power, and wealth. And there's a little bit of reference to what took place in the previous paragraphs, a couple paragraphs back, that helps us to understand this. But really the key thing that I think is probably going to throw a lot of people is he starts out talking about a judgment and the need to transform the judgment into a syllogism, which strikes us usually as, oh, this is logic, right? This has to do with, at the very least, some sort of argument that's being made. A syllogism is a kind of argument. What is Hegel on about here? He's not actually going to provide us with any syllogism at this point, so you might say, well, where is it? It's important to keep, I suppose, two things in mind. One is that the syllogism itself and judgments are not just part of logic, but also, traditionally, what has been often, substituted for logic, dialectic. And Hegel is carrying out a dialectic that is very complicated here, very different than, say, dialectic in Plato or Aristotle, and even different from what we're going to see later on in Marx, talked about his dialectic. So there's that. The other thing to keep in mind is that when Hegel brings up the syllogism, it's almost always going to be with him making some reference, as he does right here, to mediation, to a middle term. That's what allows you to have a syllogism in the first place. You have two different terms, and somehow they're going to be connected up together through a third term, through this structure of argumentation or inquiry or reasoning, right? So that's important. Now, turning to what Hegel actually is discussing here, he says, these relations. What are the relations? Likeness, unlikeness, the noble consciousness, the ignoble consciousness. They express, he says, the judgment, the determination, the bestimmen, the giving determinateness to what these two essential realities, these essences, these wesens, are as objects. Objects for what? For consciousness. So a judgment is a way for consciousness to make sense out of, in this case, of course, what are these essences? Wealth and state power, right? It turns them into objects for the consciousness. And he says, the reflection which is presented in the judgment is partly an affirmation of the one as of the other, but only for us, not for these things as they are in and for themselves. And then he says something a little bit striking here. He talks about, perhaps we might say, a distorting effect that our judgments have, in that we're not grasping wealth and state power as they really are, as he says, in and for themselves. They have not gotten to that point, or rather consciousness has not gotten to that point. He says they don't possess self-consciousness. That for which they are is not that which animates them. What is that for which they are? Consciousness, the individual, the acting individual, the ethical individual who is trying to figure out where he or she fits in the social sphere. Wealth and state power confront them as something that he says are predicates for which are not yet themselves subjects. Again, logical terminology, right? So he says, on account of this separation, the whole of the spiritual judgment falls apart into two consciousnesses, the noble and the base consciousness, right? And he says, each of which is subject to a one-sided determination. Now that is really interesting, and that's what's partly going to get us to this notion of the syllogism and the mediation. Both the noble and the base consciousness are partly right, but they're also partly wrong. Neither one of them is getting the whole picture. So Hegel goes on and he says, just as at first the indifference of the two sides of the alienation, one of which was the in itself, the specific thoughts of good and bad, the other their existence as state power and wealth. This is what I was talking about. We looked at this several paragraphs ago, was raised into a relation between them, into a judgment. We must raise this external relation to an inner unity, to a relation of thought to actuality, and the spirit of both forms of the judgment must make its appearance, right? The mind, the unifying perspective. So what we're talking about here is developing a more adequate perspective than the partly adequate perspectives of the noble and base consciousness. How are we going to do this? Hegel talks about here, we need a syllogism. The judgment turns into a syllogism. What does that mean? He says it becomes the mediating process, right? So we have a process of consciousness. We have a process of development here. And he says, in which the necessity and the middle term of both sides of the judgment come to view. So, we're not talking about a syllogism in the way that we normally think about it, Socrates is mortal, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. We're not talking about that sort of thing. We're talking about a process by which we show some sort of necessity. We actually sort of unfold it, or we find it or build it within the partial perspectives. That means we have to engage in what Hegel's calling Aufhebung, and we're going to see that happen in the paragraphs yet to come.